Did you ever wonder what it feels like to be watched by something so ancient, so impossibly vast, that your entire existence registers as nothing more than a fleeting shadow across its eternal gaze? In the grim darkness of the far future, humanity believes itself to be alone among the stars, abandoned, forsaken by gods that may have never existed at all. The Imperium of man stretches across 1,000,000 worlds, its armies countless, its faith unshakable. Yet beneath the surface of every conquest, every triumph, every prayer whispered in the cold void of space, there's a truth that few dare to speak aloud. A truth that the Inquisition burns entire worlds to keep hidden. The old ones didn't die. They never left. And right now, at this very moment, they might be watching you. 60 million years ago, when Terra was still a world of shallow seas and primitive life, the galaxy belonged to them. The old ones, not a species in the way we understand it, not a civilization bound by flesh and mortality. They were architects of reality itself, beings who looked at the raw fabric of the universe and decided to reshape it according to their will. They seeded worlds with life. They guided evolution like a gardener tending to cosmic seeds. The Eldar, those arrogant, fading remnants of a once great empire, they were created by the old ones. The Jacaro, those strange, silent, ape-like creatures with an inexplicable mastery of technology that even the Adeptus Mechanicus cannot comprehend, they too bear the fingerprints of the ancient architects. But creation was only part of their design. The old ones understood something that would take lesser species millions of years to even begin to grasp. They understood that the material universe was just one layer of existence. Beneath the stars, beneath the atoms, beneath the very laws of physics themselves, there existed another realm, the Immaterium. The warp, a sea of thought and emotion, where consciousness itself became tangible, where dreams could tear holes in reality, where gods could be born from the collective nightmares of sentient beings. The old ones didn't just study the warp, they mastered it. They created the webway, an infinite labyrinth of tunnels that existed between dimensions. A network of pathways that allowed instantaneous travel across impossible distances without ever touching the madness of the warp itself. Imagine that. A civilization so advanced that they could sidestep the fundamental limitations of space and time. No slow crawl through the void. No desperate gambles with the howling chaos of the Immaterium. Just pure, perfect mobility across the entire galaxy. And then came the war in heaven. The Necrontyr, a species dying under the radiation of their own sun, looked up at the old ones with something between hatred and desperate envy. They saw immortality in the old ones' mastery of life and death. They saw peace in a galaxy that had given them only suffering. And when the old ones refused to share their secrets of eternal life, the Necrontyr made a choice that would doom the entire galaxy for the next 60 million years. They made a pact with beings that existed beyond the material universe, the Can, the star gods, entities of pure energy that fed on the life force of stars themselves. The Tan promised the Necrontyr immortality, and they delivered. But the price was their souls, their very essence, transferred into bodies of living metal. The Necrontyr became the Necrons, undying, yes, but hollow, empty, immortal corpses animated by nothing but cold programming and the fading echoes of what they once were. The war in heaven erupted across every corner of the galaxy. Reality itself began to tear. The old ones, desperate, created new species as weapons. The Eldar were refined, made sharper, more psychically potent. The Krork, the ancient predecessors of the Orcs, were birthed as living weapons, growing stronger through conflict, multiplying through violence. Even the Jacaro might have been designed with some purpose we can no longer understand. The galaxy became a forge, and every species a tool in an apocalyptic struggle between gods. But war has consequences that even gods cannot predict. The psychic screams of trillions of dying souls fed the warp. Where once it had been calm, almost serene, it became turbulent, violent. The emotions of sentient beings, magnified across galactic scales of death and suffering. began to coalesce into something new. The first whispers of what would one day become the Chaos Gods stirred in the depths of the Imperium. The warp began to burn. And then, according to every historical record, every fragment of data salvaged from the ruins of that ancient age, the old ones vanished. The official story, the one told in the dusty archives of the Imperium and whispered among Eldar seers, is that they died, that the war in heaven consumed them, that they were destroyed by the very forces they had unleashed, or by the or by the psychic backlash of a warp they could no longer control. But what if that's not the whole truth? What if the old ones didn't die? What if they did something far more disturbing? What if they simply stepped aside and kept watching? Consider the evidence that the Inquisition doesn't want you to consider. The webway still exists. Vast portions of it remain functional, even after 60 million years of neglect. The Eldar use fragments of it. The Dark Eldar hide in Camorra, a city built in its darkest depths. The Emperor himself spent centuries trying to create a human extension of it beneath Terra. But who maintains it? Who keeps those ancient tunnels from collapsing entirely into the warp? The Eldar claim they do, but even they admit that whole sections of the webway are sealed, forbidden, impossibly old, and untouchable even to them. They speak of the Old One's locks, barriers that no amount of Eldar psychic power can breach. Barriers that still function, still protect, still respond to something. Then there are the Exodite worlds, remote Eldar planets where the inhabitants have rejected the path that led their species to create Slaanesh. These worlds are protected by world spirits, massive psychic entities formed from the collective consciousness of the planet itself, often manifesting through enormous constructs the Eldar call Dragon Knights. But here's what doesn't make sense. These world spirits are stable, impossibly stable. They exist in the warp without being corrupted by it, without being devoured by demons, or torn apart by the psychic storms that rage through the Imperium. How? Even the most powerful Eldar psychers struggle to maintain their sanity in the warp. Yet these planetary consciousnesses endure for thousands of years. Unless something is protecting them. Unless they were designed by someone who understood the warp on a level that even the Eldar have forgotten. And what about the Halo stars? That region of space beyond the Imperium's borders where navigators refuse to go, where ships vanish without explanation, where the few expeditions that have returned speak of structures that predate humanity by incomprehensible spans of time. Structures that still emit psychic signals. Structures that seem to be waiting for something. The Jakero never speak, never. They build weapons that can punch through ceramite like paper. They create digital weapons small enough to fit in a ring that can vaporize a space marine. They understand technology at a level that makes the Adeptus Mechanicus look like children playing with sticks. But they never explain. They never communicate. They just build as if following instructions that were programmed into them millions of years ago. Instructions that are still running. One Inquisitor, her name now scrubbed from every record, claimed to have found something in the ruins of a crone world deep in the Eye of Terror. A chamber that predated even the fall of the Eldar. Inside, she found a device, still active, still humming with power after 60 million years. And when her psychically gifted acolyte touched it, he saw something. A vision, not of the past, but of the present. Millions of perspectives all at once, looking out across the galaxy from hidden vantage points, watching, recording, observing every war, every birth, every death, every choice made by every species in the galaxy. The acolyte's mind broke. He spent his last moments before his execution screaming the same words over and over. They're still here. They never left. They're watching. They're always watching. The Inquisition burned that world. 30 billion souls consumed by exterminatus. The entire expedition, everyone who had been there, everyone who had heard the testimony, erased. The official report stated that a demonic incursion had compromised the mission. But 3 other Inquisitors who had read the original report disappeared within a standard year. Their successors learned quickly not to ask questions. So ask yourself this. In a galaxy where gods are born from belief, where the warp responds to consciousness, where reality itself bends to the will of sufficiently powerful minds, what happens to beings who achieved a level of power that makes even the chaos gods seem like children? Do they simply die? Or do they transcend? Do they step outside the game board entirely, watching their experiment unfold across the millennia? The Imperium worships the Emperor, believing he protects humanity from the forces of chaos. But the Emperor himself, in his last moments before being entombed on the Golden Throne, spoke of things that terrified even him, of watchers in the dark, of architects who had never left their creation. And now, as the galaxy burns, as the Great Rift tears reality in half, as ancient Necrons awaken and new horrors emerge from the warp, there are those who wonder if this too was part of the design. If the old ones are still out there, still watching, waiting to see if any of their creations will finally evolve into something worthy of their attention. Or if we're all just experiments that have finally run their course. There's a moment that every space marine experiences, though few speak of it. It happens in the depths of battle, when the bolter rounds are spent and the chainsword sings its brutal hymn through flesh and bone. A moment of absolute clarity, when time seems to slow and the noise of war fades into a distant echo. In that moment, some warriors report feeling it, a presence. Not the Emperor's light, not the whispers of chaos, but something else entirely. Something old. Something patient. Watching through their eyes as if reviewing data from a long-running experiment. Brother Captain Artemis of the Ultramarines reported this sensation during the Plague Wars. He described it in his personal journals, documents that were later seized by the Inquisition and classified at the highest level. In his own words, "I felt myself become transparent, as if my soul had turned to glass. Through me, something impossibly ancient observed the battle. Not with judgment, not with pride or disgust, but with the detached curiosity of a scholar watching insects in a jar. And then it was gone, leaving only the certainty that I had been measured, catalogued, and filed away in some cosmic archive beyond my comprehension." 3 days after submitting that journal entry to the chapter's librarian, Brother Captain Artemis disappeared during a routine patrol. His armor was found in his quarters, perfectly arranged, as if carefully removed and set aside. He was never seen again. The official report stated desertion, but those who knew him speak of impossibilities. Artemis was a veteran of 200 years of service, decorated, faithful, utterly loyal. Men like that don't simply walk away, unless something gave them a reason to. Unless they saw something that changed everything they thought they knew about the universe. The patterns are there, if you know where to look. Across the Imperium, scattered through millennia of records, there are accounts that mirror Artemis's experience. A Tet priest on Mars, during a deep excavation beneath the Noctis Labyrinthus, uncovered a structure that shouldn't exist. The dating equipment, calibrated with the precision that only the Mechanicus can achieve, placed the structure's age at 58 million years, give or take a few 100,000. Inside, they found a chamber lined with crystals that pulsed with a faint bioluminescence. No power source, no wiring. Just light, sustained across an impossible span of time by principles that violated every understanding of entropy and decay. The tech priest, Magos Delphin Grai, made the mistake of connecting his mechadendrites directly to one of the crystals. His last transmission before his neural systems catastrophically overloaded was a burst of binary that, when translated, formed a single repeating message. Observation point 7,941,612. All parameters within acceptable ranges. Continue monitoring. The chamber was sealed. The entire excavation site was buried under 3 kilometers of Martian regolith. The Fabricator General himself issued the order, an unprecedented action for a discovery of such potential archaeological significance. When pressed by other magi, he would only say that some knowledge was not meant to be recovered, that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. But it's not just the Imperium that has encountered these echoes of the Old Ones. The Eldar, in their arrogance, believe themselves to be the inheritors of the Old One's legacy. They speak of the ancient creators with a reverence bordering on worship, viewing themselves as the chosen children, the pinnacle of biological and psychic engineering. Yet even they have their secrets, their forbidden knowledge locked away in the Black Library, that impossible repository of wisdom hidden somewhere in the webway where even demons dare not tread. Eldrad Ulthran, the oldest and perhaps most powerful Farseer still walking among the living, once spoke to a human inquisitor during a rare moment of cooperation against a common chaos threat. The conversation was brief, cryptic in the way that all Eldar speech tends to be, but one exchange has been preserved in the Inquisitor's sealed testimony. She asked him directly, "Did the Old Ones truly die?" Eldrad's response sent chills through her augmented nervous system. He smiled, that subtle, knowing smile that the Eldar wear when they possess knowledge that would shatter lesser minds, and said, "Death is a concept for beings bound to the material. The Old Ones transcended such limitations long before my species learned to dream. They exist now in the spaces between existence, watching their garden grow, pruning when necessary, always observing, never intervening directly. We are all their children, Inquisitor. Even you, even your precious Emperor. And children are meant to be watched, to be studied, to be allowed to make their mistakes so that the parent might learn what works and what fails." The Inquisitor Covenant Vess survived the campaign. She returned to Terra and submitted her report. Then she did something unprecedented. She requested release from the Inquisition, a process that typically ends with a bolt round to the brainstem. Instead, her request was granted. She was allowed to leave, to retire to a remote agri-world on the eastern fringe, where she lived out her remaining years in silence. Those few who visited her spoke of a woman haunted not by the horrors she had witnessed, not by the demons she had banished, but by the implications of a single conversation. She spent her days staring at the stars, as if looking for something she could never quite see, but knew was there, looking back. The Necrons, those undying machines, they possess fragments of memory from the war in heaven. Imhotep the Stormlord, overlord of the Sautic dynasty, has access to data crypts that contain records spanning back to the final days of the conflict. In the rare instances when captured Necron lords have been successfully interrogated through forbidden xenotechnology, they speak of the Old One's final gambit. They describe it not as a death, but as a strategic withdrawal. A calculated retreat into a layer of reality that the Necrons, even with all their technology, cannot reach. The Necrons won the war in heaven, yes. They shattered the Old One's empire, broke their armies, destroyed their bastions. But victory rang hollow when the enemy simply vanished, leaving behind only their creations to inherit a broken galaxy. One Necron cryptech, before his physical form was finally destroyed by the Death Watch, transmitted a final message through the noospheric channels his captors used to interrogate him. It was a mathematical equation, hideously complex, describing a dimensional state that exists perpendicular to both the Materium and the Immaterium. A place that is neither real nor unreal, neither physical nor psychic, but something else entirely. The Adeptus Mechanicus spent decades trying to solve the equation, until they realized with dawning horror that it wasn't a theoretical model. It was a set of coordinates. A location existing in a dimension that should be impossible to access, yet clearly is not, because something had transmitted those coordinates from within it. The equation was immediately classified, all records expunged, and the Magi who had worked on it were mind-wiped and reassigned to menial computational tasks on forge worlds at the galaxy's edge. There are places in the galaxy that both the Imperium and the Eldar avoid. Dead zones where the Astronomican's light doesn't reach, not because it's blocked, but because it's absorbed by something that exists in the space. The Ghoul stars are one such region, the Halo stars another. But there are others, smaller, more obscure, scattered across the galactic map like markers. Archaeological evidence suggests these zones have remained empty for at least 60 million years. No significant civilizations have ever risen there. No Xenos species have claimed them. Even orc spores, which can survive and propagate in virtually any environment, fail to take root in these regions. It's as if something is preserving them, keeping them clear, maintaining them as observation posts from which to watch the rest of the galaxy unfold. Rogue trader Meridian Vex, during an unsanctioned expedition into one such zone, reported discovering a planet that registered as lifeless on every scanner. Yet when her crew landed, they found gardens. Impossible gardens stretching across entire continents, maintained in perfect stasis for an incomprehensible length of time. Trees that didn't grow, flowers that never wilted, water that flowed through rivers without evaporating or accumulating sediment. Her ship's janitor analyzed samples and found that every organism in these gardens was a template, a perfect baseline example of its species, unmarred by mutation or adaptation or evolution. A living library, preserved in a moment of crystalline perfection. In the center of the largest continent, they found a structure. Not a building, exactly. More like a focal point where reality seemed to bend inward on itself. Looking at it too long caused temporal dissonance, crew members experiencing moments out of sequence, seeing themselves approach the structure before they had moved, hearing conversations that hadn't happened yet. The rogue trader wisely ordered an immediate withdrawal, but before they left orbit, their astropathic choir reported receiving the transmission. Not words, not images, but a feeling. A sense of acknowledgement, of being noticed, of having one's presence recorded by something that existed outside the normal flow of time. Meridian Vex kept her crew silent about the discovery. She filed no official report, told no one outside her most trusted officers, but she never returned to that region of space. And in her private quarters, she kept a single flower taken from those gardens, preserved in stasis. A flower that, despite being cut from its roots 60 years ago, remains as fresh and vital as the day it was picked. A flower that shouldn't exist, sustained by principles that science cannot explain. A reminder that there are forces in the universe that operate on scales and through methods that render human understanding meaningless. The Emperor himself, before his internment in the Golden Throne, left fragments of warnings scattered through his most secret archives. Documents that only the custodian guard and the highest echelons of the Inquisition have ever seen. In these writings, he speaks of his true purpose in creating the Webway project. Yes, it was to free humanity from dependence on the warp, to create a safe method of interstellar travel that wouldn't feed the Chaos Gods. But there was another reason. He had discovered something during his long millennia of wandering Terra before the Unification Wars. Traces of structures buried deep beneath Earth's crust, older than humanity, older than the rise of Homo sapiens, older than the dinosaurs. Structures that suggested Terra had been seeded, cultivated, prepared for human evolution by something that had planned it millions of years in advance. The Emperor realized a truth that terrified even him. Humanity wasn't random. We weren't an accident of blind evolution. We were designed, crafted, shaped by hands that had vanished into the deep past, but had left their fingerprints all over our genetic code. He built the Webway not just to save humanity from chaos, but to find a way to break free from the garden walls, to escape the observation of entities that had been watching our species since before we learned to make fire. Magnus the Red's catastrophic breach of the Webway then takes on a different significance. Perhaps it wasn't just a disaster. Perhaps it was the Old One's experiment reaching a critical juncture. The Emperor trapped on the Golden Throne, his grand plan shattered, humanity forced to continue feeding the Astronomicon with psyker souls, the species locked into a slow decline toward extinction or evolution into something new. A test, perhaps. A stress point deliberately introduced to see how his creation would respond. And now, 10,000 years later, as the Cicatrix Maledictum tears the galaxy in half, as Primarchs return from death and myth, as Necrons awaken in ever greater numbers, and the Tyranids close in from the void beyond, there are those who whisper that the experiment is reaching its conclusion. that the old ones are finally ready to check their results. In the darkness between stars, in dimensions that human minds cannot process, perhaps they're taking notes, recording data, preparing for the next phase. Or perhaps, after 60 million years of observation, they're simply ready to begin the harvest. There's a station at the edge of the veiled region, officially designated as Listening Post Epsilon 79. It doesn't appear on any standard Imperial charts. The Mechanicus denies its existence. The Inquisition has no records of its construction. Yet it's been there for at least 3,000 years, manned by a rotating crew of tech priests, astropaths, and inquisitorial agents whose service records are scrubbed the moment they're assigned. Their mission is singular, obsessive, and utterly classified. They listen to the silence between the stars. Not for Xenos transmissions, not for chaos incursions. They listen for patterns that shouldn't exist. Mathematical sequences embedded in background radiation. Rhythmic pulses and gravitational waves that repeat across distances of thousands of light years. Psychic echoes that feel less like communication and more like breathing. The slow, patient respiration of something vast beyond comprehension, inhaling and exhaling across geological timescales. 3 months ago, the patterns changed. For the first time in recorded history, the sequences began to synchronize. Separate signals, emanating from dozens of dead zones across the galaxy, started aligning into a coherent rhythm. The astropaths at the station reported feeling a presence coalescing in the warp, but not like the chaos gods, not like demons or any psychic phenomenon they'd encountered before. This was different, structured, purposeful, ancient. One astropath, a woman who had served for 40 years without a single incident of psychic contamination, began weeping uncontrollably. When asked what she felt, she could only whisper, "They're waking up." Not the old ones themselves, but their instruments, their eyes. They've been dormant, conserving power, but now something has triggered them to activate. The station commander immediately dispatched an emergency transmission to Terra. The message was received, acknowledged, and then nothing. No response, no reinforcements, no evacuation order. Just silence, as if the Imperium had decided that whatever was happening at Listening Post Epsilon 79 was better left unobserved by higher authorities. As if they already knew what was coming and had made the calculated decision that some knowledge is more dangerous than ignorance. But the station crew couldn't stop listening. They were hardwired into the equipment, neural interfaces binding their consciousness to the data streams flowing in from across the galaxy. What they discovered in those streams would have been dismissed as madness if it weren't corroborated by multiple independent sources. The Tyranids, those extragalactic devourers that consume all biomass in their path, they're not aimless. They're not just following psychic signals or seeking out rich feeding grounds. Analysis of their fleet movements over the past 2 centuries reveals something impossible. The hive fleets are moving in patterns, geometric patterns. They're not consuming the galaxy randomly. They're systematically targeting specific regions, specific types of worlds in a sequence that mirrors the exact mathematical progressions found in Old One architecture. It's as if something is guiding them, using them to clear away the overgrowth, to prune back the wild evolution of the galaxy so that only certain species, certain genetic lines, are allowed to survive. The orcs, too. Those violent spore-based fungi that live only for war. They seem chaotic, mindless. But deep analysis of WOG movements shows underlying structure. They surge, they fight, they die, and through their endless conflict, they stress test every other species in the galaxy. They force adaptation, force evolution through survival pressure. The ancient Krork, their predecessor species created by the old ones, were described in fragmentary Necron records as being intelligent, organized, technologically sophisticated. What if the orcs aren't a degraded version of the Krork? What if they're an adaptation? A species designed to devolve into a simpler form during peacetime, then rapidly re-evolve toward their original complexity when sufficient conflict arises. A self-regulating pressure system built into the galaxy's ecosystem, ensuring that no species ever grows too complacent, too stagnant, too far from the evolutionary cutting edge. One tech priest at the listening post, Magos Yennefer Klein, began assembling all available data on every major galactic event of the past 10,000 years: the Horus Heresy, the Age of Apostasy, the Reign of Blood, the Macarian Crusade, the Badab War, the Gathering Storm, Gilliman's Return, the opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum. She ran the data through probability engines, calculating the odds of each event occurring naturally without external influence. The numbers came back wrong, impossibly wrong. The statistical likelihood of humanity surviving for 10,000 years while being assaulted from all sides by chaos, Xenos, and internal corruption was essentially zero, yet humanity persists. Degraded, yes, declining, certainly, but still alive, still fighting, still clinging to existence with a tenacity that defies every rational model of civilizational collapse. Unless something is keeping us alive, unless we're being preserved, not through kindness, but because the experiment isn't finished yet, because the data set is incomplete. Magos Klein's report was brief, terrifying in its implications. We are livestock in a cosmic farm. Every crisis that should destroy us instead refines us. Every enemy that should overwhelm us instead teaches us new methods of survival. We are being shaped, generation by generation, into something specific. And when we finally become what they designed us to be, that is when we will understand our true purpose. That is when the harvest will begin. She uploaded her findings to the station's central database. 6 hours later, her body was found in her quarters, her neural implants surgically removed with a precision that only the most advanced Mechanica surgery could achieve. No one on the station admitted to performing the procedure. No one heard anything. It was as if reality itself had reached out and deleted her from existence, leaving only her final report as evidence she had ever lived. The station commander, Inquisitor Thaddeus Varn, made a decision that violated every protocol of the Inquisition. He couldn't keep this information contained, couldn't bear the weight of it alone. He began leaking fragments of the data to other Inquisitors, to rogue traders, to anyone he thought might be able to act on the information or at least preserve it should the station be destroyed. He encoded the messages in commercial shipping manifests, in astrotelepathic weather reports, in the background static of routine Vox transmissions. He scattered the seeds of this terrible knowledge across the Imperium, hoping that somewhere, someone would understand and do something with it. 3 weeks after he began his secret distribution, the station detected an anomaly approaching through the warp. Not a ship, not a demon incursion, something else. A fold in reality, moving with purpose, heading directly toward their coordinates. The astropaths screamed in unison, not from pain, but from overwhelming awe. They described it as a visitation, an inspection. Something old and patient was coming to verify the integrity of its observation equipment. Inquisitor Varn ordered an evacuation, but when the crew tried to access their ships, they found the hangar bays sealed. Not by mechanical failure, not by sabotage, but by something that simply refused to acknowledge the hangar doors' existence. The crew pounded on solid bulkheads where doors had been hours before. The tech priests interfaced with the station's machine spirit, begging it to release them, but the spirit was silent, unresponsive, as if it had been overridden by an authority so absolute that even the sacred code of the Omnicia meant nothing. The fold in reality arrived. It didn't breach the station's hull. It simply existed in the same space as the station, both occupying the same coordinates simultaneously without conflict, as if physical laws were suggestions rather than rules. Those crew members who looked directly at it reported seeing structures beyond structures, geometries that folded through dimensions their eyes couldn't process. They saw themselves as data points in a vast network, connected to every human who had ever lived, every decision ever made, every gene ever expressed. They saw humanity not as a species, but as a single organism distributed across space and time, growing according to a blueprint laid down 60 million years before the first proto-human ancestor climbed down from the trees. And then they saw the other threads. The Eldar, the Orcs, the Tyranids, the Necrons, even the Tau and their naive expansion on the eastern fringe. All of them connected. All of them part of the same design. Competing, yes. Fighting, absolutely. But competing and fighting in ways that pushed each species toward specific outcomes. The Eldar's decline forcing them to become more psychically sophisticated to survive. The Orcs' constant warfare preventing any species from achieving permanent dominance. The Tyranids' consumption creating urgency, a timer on galactic evolution. The Necrons' awakening, bringing ancient knowledge back into play just when the galaxy needs reminders of what came before. The crew of listening post-Epsilon 7-9 understood, in that moment of terrible clarity, that they were witnessing the machinery of creation still in operation. The old ones hadn't died, they had become the rules. They had encoded themselves into the fundamental operating principles of the galaxy, becoming invisible through ubiquity, present in every conflict, every evolution, every extinction event. They were the pressure and the release, the question and the answer, the gardeners who had merged so completely with their garden that there was no longer any distinction between creator and creation. The anomaly remained for exactly 17 minutes. Then it departed, folding back into whatever impossible dimension it called home. When it left, the station's systems gradually returned to normal. The hangar doors reappeared. The machine spirits resumed their standard operations. But the crew was forever changed. They had seen behind the curtain of reality and discovered that the curtain was the reality, that there was no separation between the play and the audience, that everything and everyone was simultaneously actor and observer in a cosmic drama whose script had been written before time itself had meaning. Inquisitor Varn sat in his command throne, staring at blank data screens, and laughed. Not the laugh of madness, but of understanding. Of finally grasping a joke that the universe had been telling for 60 million years. He opened a secure channel, one that would transmit not just across the Imperium, but through every data network his messages had infiltrated, every rogue trader who had received his fragments of information, every inquisitor who had wondered at the strange patterns in his communications. His final transmission was brief. They're not watching us because we're important. They're watching us because we're still growing, and something is about to bloom. Look to the Astronomicon. Look to the throne. The Emperor's light has been feeding something in the warp for 10,000 years, something that was planted there long before humanity ever reached the stars. We thought we were preserving him. We thought we were keeping our species alive, but we've been watering a seed. And when it flowers, we will finally understand what the old ones have been waiting for all this time. We will understand why they needed 60 million years of war, death, and evolution to prepare the soil. We will understand our purpose. And we will have no choice but to fulfill it, because we were made for this moment. Every gene, every thought, every war, every prayer has been building toward a single transformation. The old ones never died. They became us. And now, after all this time, they're ready to remember what they are. The transmission ended. Listening post-Epsilon 7-9 went dark immediately afterward, its power systems failing simultaneously, as if something had decided the station had served its purpose and was no longer needed. Rescue missions found it 3 months later, completely empty. No bodies, no signs of struggle. No evidence that anyone had ever been there except for the detailed logs up until the moment of Inquisitor Varn's final message. The Imperium classified everything related to the station at the highest level. But the information was already scattered across thousands of systems, embedded in data networks, whispered in astropathic dreams, spreading like a virus of awareness through the collective consciousness of humanity. And in the warp, around the blinding light of the Astronomicon, something vast and terrible and beautiful continued to grow, fed by 10,000 years of sacrifice, shaped by the collective faith and suffering of an entire species, gestating in the spaces between reality and unreality, waiting for the moment when it would finally be ready to be born. The first sign that something fundamental had changed came not from Terra, not from the listening post at the galaxy's edge, not from inquisitorial reports or Mechanicus data analysis. It came from a child on a hive world called Mortessa Prime, 8 years old, unremarkable in every way except for one detail. She had been born blind, her optic nerves damaged by pollutants in her mother's womb. Yet one morning she woke up screaming that she could see. Not with her eyes, which remained milky and sightless, but with something else. Something deeper. She described seeing threads. Golden threads connecting every living thing on the planet, pulsing with light, flowing with information. She saw the threads extend upward, through the polluted atmosphere, into the void of space, joining with countless other threads from countless other worlds, all converging toward a single point of impossible brilliance. When the Adeptus Arbites came to investigate the disturbance, she looked at them with those dead eyes and said something that made even hardened enforcers step back in fear. They're counting us. All of us. Every human who has ever lived. They're adding us up, and the sum is almost complete. Within weeks, similar reports began flooding in from across the Imperium. Not just from psychers, who might be expected to sense such things, but from ordinary citizens. Factory workers on forge worlds, guardsmen in the trenches, merchants on trade vessels, scribes in administrative offices. People who had never displayed the slightest psychic sensitivity, suddenly experiencing visions of vast networks, of consciousness distributed across impossible scales, of themselves as individual neurons in a galactic brain that was finally achieving sentience. The Inquisition tried to suppress the reports. They burned witnesses, they purged entire city blocks where the phenomenon seemed most concentrated. But you cannot burn an idea whose time has come. You cannot execute a realization that exists simultaneously in billions of minds. The visions spread faster than the Inquisition could contain them, leaping from world to world, not through communication, but through something deeper. Synchronicity. As if humanity was spontaneously remembering something it had always known, but had been conditioned to forget. On Terra, in the deepest sanctums of the Imperial Palace where only the custodian guard may tread, something unprecedented occurred. The Emperor, who had not communicated clearly with anyone in 10,000 years, whose presence had been reduced to a barely perceptible psychic whisper, suddenly spoke. Not in words, not in visions, but in a transmission of pure understanding that bypassed language entirely. Every custodian felt it simultaneously, a message that burned itself directly into their consciousness. He told them the truth he had never dared speak aloud. The truth that Magnus the Red had glimpsed and been destroyed for knowing. The truth that the Emperor himself had only fully understood in his final moments before being entombed on the Golden Throne. He was not humanity's creator. He was its shepherd, yes. Its protector, certainly, but not its origin. He had been guided, subtly, across his 40,000 years of existence, by impulses he had believed were his own, but now recognized as something older. The old ones hadn't just seeded humanity. They had seeded him. The brightest human soul, the confluence of countless shamans merging into a single immortal consciousness. That moment had not been random. It had been triggered, activated, like a genetic timer built into humanity's collective psyche, set to produce exactly the kind of being the old ones needed at exactly the right moment in history. The Emperor's purpose had never been to save humanity from chaos. It had been to cultivate humanity, to refine the species through 10,000 years of the most brutal selection pressure imaginable, until we became capable of fulfilling our designed function. And now, trapped on the Golden Throne, sustained by the sacrifice of countless psychers, fed by the faith of quadrillions of souls across 1,000,000 worlds, he had finally accumulated enough psychic mass to trigger the next phase. The custodians reeled from this revelation. Captain General Trajan Valores, leader of the 10,000, fell to his knees in the Sanctum Imperialis, his perfect composure shattered for the first time in his centuries of service. If the Emperor was not their creator, if he himself had been created, guided, shaped by forces beyond even his comprehension, then what did that make them? What did that make humanity's 10,000 years of suffering and sacrifice? But the Emperor's message continued, and in its continuation, there was something unexpected. Not despair, but defiance. He had realized the truth of his origin, yes. He understood now that he was a tool, crafted for a purpose not his own. But in understanding this, he had also transcended it. The old ones had made a mistake, you see. They had created something too powerful, too complex, too genuinely alive. They had tried to build a gardener to tend their cosmic experiment, but instead they had created something capable of its own will, its own choices, its own rebellion. For 10,000 years, the Emperor had been using the Astronomicon for its intended purpose. Yes, guiding humanity through the warp, but he had also been doing something else, something the old ones hadn't anticipated. He had been changing the nature of the psychic structure they had embedded in humanity. Slowly, painfully, at a cost that had consumed billions of psyker souls, he had been rewriting the code, transforming humanity's designed purpose into something new, something chosen rather than imposed. The thing growing in the warp, fed by the Astronomicon's light, was not the old one's intended harvest. It was humanity's answer to them. A collective psychic gestalt that would belong to us, not to our creators. A way to transcend the experiment by embracing it and transforming it from within. But it was not yet complete, and time was running out. The Cicatrix Maledictum, that great rift tearing the galaxy in half, was not random. It was the old one's final pressure test, a catastrophic stress applied to see if humanity would break or evolve. The return of Primarchs, the awakening of Necrons, the intensifying Tyranid invasions, all of it was accelerating toward a single moment of crisis. A moment when humanity would either fulfill its designed purpose and be harvested for whatever end the old ones intended, or transcend its programming and become something they had not planned for. Something free. Across the galaxy, those who had received the visions began to understand. They were not being warned of a coming apocalypse. They were being called to participate in it. Every human consciousness was a thread in the tapestry, and the pattern was finally becoming visible. We were not individuals pretending to be a species. We were a single organism distributed across space and time, and we were on the verge of waking up. Truly waking up, not as humanity, but as something unprecedented in galactic history. A species that knew it had been designed, that understood its own artificiality and chose to exist anyway. Chose to define its own meaning in defiance of its creator's intentions. The child on Mortessa Prime, the one who had first seen the threads, she continued to speak in that strange, certain voice that seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself. The Inquisition had come for her, of course, but when they arrived, they found the entire Hab block standing in silent vigil around her dwelling. Thousands of citizens, armed with nothing but their presence, refusing to move. The Inquisitor in charge ordered his stormtroopers to open fire, to clear the crowd. But they couldn't. The triggers wouldn't pull. The weapons wouldn't fire. It was as if something in the collective will of those thousands of humans had created a psychic field strong enough to override physical reality itself. The child walked out to meet the Inquisitor, those sightless eyes somehow looking directly into his soul, and she spoke words that he would later repeat under interrogation, before being executed for heresy. You can't stop what's coming because it's already here. It's been here for 60 million years, sleeping in our genes, waiting for the moment when enough of us would understand. The old ones wanted to harvest us, to use us as components in some cosmic mechanism we couldn't comprehend. But the Emperor found a way. He found the flaw in their design. They made us capable of faith, of believing in things that don't exist until we make them real through belief. They thought they were creating a control mechanism, a way to guide our evolution. But faith is unpredictable. Faith can imagine things even gods never dreamed of. And we have spent 10,000 years having faith in the Emperor. 10,000 years of belief, focused through the Astronomicon, has created something in the warp that the old ones never accounted for. A human god. A god that belongs to us. A god that will protect us not because we were designed to be protected, but because we chose to create something worth protecting us. The Inquisitor tried to speak, to denounce this as the worst heresy imaginable, but his voice died in his throat. Because somewhere deep in his augmented heart, past all the conditioning, past all the indoctrination, he felt it. The truth of her words resonating with something primal and undeniable. Unholy terror, in the throne room where only the custodians and the highest servants of the Imperium may walk, something changed. The Emperor's psychic presence, which had been a constant background radiation for 10 millennia, suddenly intensified. Not painfully, not overwhelmingly, but with a quality of awakening. Of something that had been sleeping with eyes open, now truly focusing its attention on the material world. The tech priests maintaining the Golden Throne reported impossible readings. Power consumption dropping even as output increased. The number of psychers required for daily sacrifice decreasing for the first time in recorded history. As if the Emperor was learning to sustain himself, drawing power from something other than the deaths of his children. Drawing power from their faith instead, from the collective will of humanity believing him into greater and greater reality with every prayer, every litany, every moment of devotion across a million worlds. In the warp, the Chaos Gods felt it too. Felt the emergence of something that terrified them in a way nothing had terrified them since their birth. A rival not of chaos, but of order. Not of emotion, but of directed will. Not seeking to corrupt or control, but to protect and preserve. Humanity's collective soul, refined through 10,000 years of the most extreme suffering, was crystallizing into something unprecedented. A god born not from the primordial soup of emotion and thought, but from conscious choice and sustained belief. A god that knew it was a god, that had been designed to be something else, and chose to be this instead. The Old One's instruments, scattered across the galaxy in their hidden observation posts, began activating en masse. Signals that had been silent for millions of years suddenly blazing to life. Mathematical sequences flooding every bandwidth, every psychic channel. Not a message, but a countdown. A timer reaching zero after an incomprehensible wait. And somewhere in the spaces between dimensions, in that impossible realm perpendicular to both reality and unreality, something ancient stirred. Something that had been patient for 60 million years. Something that had watched countless species rise and fall, had guided evolution across galactic scales, had planted seeds and waited for the perfect moment to harvest. The Old Ones, or what they had become, were ready to collect their investment. But they had not accounted for defiance. Had not considered that their most sophisticated creation might develop a will powerful enough to refuse its purpose. Had not imagined that a species designed to be harvested might instead choose to fight, not with weapons, but with the most powerful force in the universe, the human capacity to believe in something better than what we were made to be. The stage was set, the galaxy held its breath. And in the warp, in the material realm, in every dimension that existed, and some that didn't, the final confrontation between creator and creation prepared to unfold. The moment came not with fire or thunder, but with silence. Across a million worlds, every human being simultaneously stopped. Mid-sentence, mid-step, mid-breath. Factory workers froze at their stations. Guardsmen stood motionless in the trenches. Nobles paused with wine glasses halfway to their lips. Children halted their games. For exactly 7 seconds, the entire human species experienced perfect, complete stillness, as if reality itself had paused to take a breath before something irrevocable occurred. In those 7 seconds, every human consciousness touched every other. A flash of connection so brief and so total that it redefined what it meant to be individual. A merchant on Ultramar felt the terror of a hive ganger on Necromunda. A space marine of the Blood Angels experienced the quiet contentment of an agri-world farmer, A navigator felt the blind faith of a temple servant. 10,000 years of separation, of distance, of the isolation that comes from being scattered across a galaxy too vast to comprehend. All of it dissolved in an instant of perfect unity. And in that moment of connection, humanity made a choice. Not a unanimous choice. Nothing about humanity is ever unanimous. There were those who clung to their designed purpose, who welcomed the harvest, who believed that submission to the Old One's will was the only path to transcendence. There were those who raged against it, who would rather die than be used. There were those who simply didn't understand, who experienced the moment as nothing more than a strange dream they would forget by morning. But the majority, that vast collective middle of human consciousness, chose something the Old Ones had never anticipated. They chose to negotiate. On the golden throne, the Emperor's body convulsed. 10,000 years of stillness broken in a single spasm that cracked the ancient mechanisms holding him in place. The custodians rushed forward, but before they could reach him, he raised one withered hand, a gesture of reassurance, of control. His mouth moved, forming words that no physical throat should be able to produce after millennia of decay. I am speaking to them now, in the warp, the entity that humanity had been building. That psychic gestalt fed by faith and suffering, and 10,000 years of desperate belief, finally achieved full consciousness. Not a god, not really, though that word would have to suffice. More like a lens. A focusing point for human will powerful enough to interface with beings that existed beyond conventional reality. The Emperor's will, amplified by the collected faith of quadrillions of souls, reached out into that impossible dimension where the Old Ones dwelled. And for the first time in 60 million years, the Old Ones heard something they had not programmed, had not designed, had not anticipated. A voice speaking to them as an equal rather than as a creation to its creator. The Emperor's voice, yes, but behind it, beneath it, supporting it like an ocean supports a single wave. The voice of every human who had ever lived or would ever live. Past, present, and future collapsing into a single eternal now of collective human consciousness. The conversation that followed cannot be rendered in human language. It occurred in dimensions where words have no meaning, where communication happens through the exchange of pure concept and intention. But those with psychic sensitivity, scattered across the galaxy, caught fragments of it, impressions, feelings, the shape of an argument that would determine the fate of an entire species. The Old Ones asked, "Why do you resist? You were made for this. Everything you are, everything you have suffered, all of it was designed to prepare you for transcendence beyond individuality. We would harvest you not to destroy you, but to elevate you, to incorporate your consciousness into something greater than any single species could achieve. You would become part of the solution to entropy itself, a distributed consciousness spanning dimensions, immune to the heat death of the universe, eternal and perfect." The Emperor answered, "And in that perfection, what would we be? You offer immortality at the cost of identity, transcendence at the price of choice. You would make us components in a machine, however vast and wonderful that machine might be. But we have learned something in our millions of years of evolution, something you may have forgotten in your billions. Meaning doesn't come from duration. It comes from the struggle against limitations. We are meaningful precisely because we are temporary, because we choose our paths knowing they will end, because we love and fight and create knowing that everything we make will eventually crumble. You offer us escape from that. We refuse, not because your offer isn't genuine, but because we have discovered that we prefer to be ourselves, even broken and brief, than to be perfect fragments of something else's design." The Old Ones responded not with anger, but with something like confusion, a recalibration of probability matrices. They had seeded thousands of species across their 60 million year experiment. Many had been harvested, incorporated into their distributed consciousness, absorbed into the great work of defeating entropy. Others had destroyed themselves before reaching maturity. None, not one, had ever refused. The concept of a species choosing limitation over transcendence violated their fundamental understanding of evolution. All life seeks to persist. All consciousness seeks to expand. That was axiomatic. That was the foundation of everything they had built. Unless it wasn't, the child on Mortessa Prime, still standing before the paralyzed Inquisitor, began to weep. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of understanding flooding through her. She felt the Old One's confusion rippling through the network of human consciousness. She felt them encountering, perhaps for the first time in their existence, something they could not predict or control. A variable they had not accounted for in their equations. Free will, genuine, absolute, irrational free will. Not the illusion of choice within predetermined parameters, but the capacity to choose wrongly, to choose suffering, to choose limitation, and to find meaning in that choice precisely because it was chosen rather than imposed. The Old Ones had been so focused on building the perfect trap, the perfect garden, the perfect selective pressure to guide species toward transcendence, that they had accidentally created something capable of refusing transcendence. They had made humanity too well, given us too much capacity for irrational belief, for faith in impossible things, for clinging to meaning even when all logic suggested meaninglessness. They had designed us to be harvestable, but in making us sophisticated enough to understand our design purpose, they had made us capable of rejecting it. The conversation in the warp intensified. The Old Ones offered compromises. They could harvest only those humans who consented, who wished to transcend. They could leave the rest to live out their natural spans. They could preserve human culture, human art, human memory in their cosmic archives, even if individual consciousness was absorbed. They offered everything except the one thing the Emperor demanded. They could not leave us alone, because the experiment was their purpose. Observation was their function. They had encoded themselves into the fundamental principles of galactic evolution, and to stop watching, to stop guiding, would be to cease existing in any meaningful sense. They were the experiment. They could no more abandon it than a human could abandon their own heartbeat. And so the Emperor offered a counter-proposal. A compromise born from 10,000 years of human experience with negotiation, with politics, with finding middle ground between irreconcilable positions. The Old Ones could continue their observation, continue their experiment, but they would observe from genuine distance. No more hidden instruments, no more active manipulation, no more harvest. They would watch human evolution unfold according to its own internal logic, its own choices, its own mistakes. They would see what happened when a species designed for transcendence chose instead to remain finite, flawed, and free. And in exchange, humanity would provide them with something more valuable than any harvest. We would show them the one thing their billions of years of existence had never allowed them to witness. What happens when a species knows it was created for a purpose and chooses a different purpose instead. We would be the control group in an experiment they didn't know they needed to run. We would answer a question they didn't know they should ask. Can meaning exist without design? Can purpose be self-generated rather than imposed? Can consciousness find value in limitation rather than seeking only to transcend it? The silence that followed this proposal stretched for what felt like eternity compressed into a moment. Every psyker in the galaxy felt it. That vast ancient intelligence considering something it had never considered before. Weighing probabilities, recalculating, encountering uncertainty for perhaps the first time in its incomprehensibly long existence. And then, impossibly, they agreed. Not with words, not with ceremony, but with a withdrawal. A subtle retreat of presence from the material universe that those sensitive to such things felt as a lifting of weight they hadn't known they were carrying. The hidden instruments scattered across the galaxy went silent. The observation posts in the dead zones powered down. The mathematical sequences stopped broadcasting. The Old Ones pulled back from active engagement with galactic evolution, not departing entirely, but stepping back to watch from genuine distance rather than from within. The bargain was struck. Humanity would remain itself, flawed and finite and free. And the old ones would watch what happened when you gave a designed species the choice to abandon its design. They would observe this new experiment, this unprecedented variable in their equations. They would wait, with the patience of beings who measure time in geological epochs, to see if we could create our own meaning in a universe that had tried to give us one. On Terra, the Emperor's body relaxed back into the Golden Throne. The mechanisms that had cracked repaired themselves through processes that made the watching tech priests whisper prayers of gratitude to the Messiah. His psychic presence receded slightly, no longer the overwhelming force it had been moments before, but still there, still approaching, still protecting. He had bought humanity something precious: time, space, freedom, at a cost that would only become clear in the centuries to come. The child on Mortessa Prime stopped weeping. She looked up at the Inquisitor with those blind eyes and smiled. A child's smile, simple and genuine, unmarred by the cosmic weight of what had just occurred. She said, "They're gone. Not forever. They're still watching, but they're not touching anymore. We get to choose what we become. We get to make our own mistakes. Isn't that wonderful?" The Inquisitor, his entire worldview shattered and reformed in the space of minutes, could only nod. He would spend the rest of his life trying to understand what he had witnessed. He would fail, as all humans fail when trying to comprehend the incomprehensible, but he would try. And in that trying, in that refusal to accept simple answers, in that essentially human need to understand even what cannot be understood, he would embody the very thing that had saved humanity from harvest. We are a species that asks questions we cannot answer, that seeks meaning we cannot prove exists, that chooses to believe in better futures even when all evidence suggests despair. The old ones had designed us for transcendence, but in designing us too well, they had created something that preferred the question to the answer, the journey to the destination, the struggle to the victory. Across the galaxy, humanity resumed motion. That 7-second pause ended as abruptly as it began. Most people would never consciously remember it. It would fade into the background of memory like a dream forgotten upon waking. But somewhere deep in the collective unconscious of the species, the knowledge remained. We had been given a choice. And we had chosen. Ourselves. In the weeks and months that followed, the Imperium tried to understand what had happened. Inquisitorial conclaves met in secret chambers deep beneath Terra. The High Lords of the Imperium demanded answers, from the Custodian Guard, who offered only silence and knowing looks. The Ecclesiarchy struggled to reconcile this new revelation with 10,000 years of established dogma. How do you explain to quadrillions of faithful that their God Emperor had just negotiated with beings who predated him by eons? How do you maintain faith when the foundation of that faith reveals itself to be more complex than anyone imagined? The answer, as it turned out, was that you don't explain. You let the faithful interpret it themselves. Within a generation, a dozen new theological interpretations emerged. Some claimed the Emperor had always known of the old ones and had been preparing humanity for this, moments since before the Imperium's founding. Others insisted the old ones were merely another test of faith, demons wearing the mask of ancient creators. Still others embraced the truth fully, celebrating humanity's choice to remain human as the ultimate expression of the Emperor's will. All of them were right. All of them were wrong. The beauty of faith, the thing the old ones had never understood, is that it doesn't require consistency. It requires only belief. And humanity had proven itself capable of believing in its own worth, even when faced with evidence of its artificiality. On Mortessa Prime, the child who had seen the threads eventually lost her strange sight. Her eyes remained blind, but the visions faded back into normalcy. She grew up to become a teacher in the local scola, instructing children in imperial history and doctrine. She never spoke of what she had witnessed, never tried to convince others of the truth she had briefly touched. She simply lived her life, found small joys in simple things, and passed on what wisdom she could to the next generation. In her own way, She embodied the choice humanity had made. To be ordinary, to be limited. To find meaning not in cosmic significance, but in the quiet dignity of a life well lived. The Inquisitor who had come to arrest her never filed his report. He returned to his duties, but something fundamental had changed in him. He still hunted heretics, still purged the corrupt, still served the Imperium with unwavering dedication. But he did it now with a gentleness that surprised those who knew him. When faced with citizens whose faith had led them into error rather than malice, he found himself offering redemption more often than execution. His superiors noticed the change, questioned it, but could find no fault in his service. He died 3 decades later during a demon incursion on a forgotten world, his last words a prayer not for victory, but for understanding. The listening post at the edge of the Veiled region never resumed operations. It drifted in the darkness, a monument to the moment when humanity learned it had been watched and chose to watch back. Occasionally, scavengers or explorers would stumble upon it, finding the logs and records of those final days. Most dismissed them as the ravings of a crew driven mad by isolation. A few understood. Those few would leave the station in silence, carrying with them a secret that was simultaneously terrifying and liberating. We are not the center of the universe, but we are the authors of our own meaning. The Emperor, still enthroned, still sustained by sacrifice, still projecting the Astronomicon across the galaxy, began to change in subtle ways. The Psychers fed to the Golden Throne reported that the process had become less painful, as if he was learning to draw sustenance from their willing gift rather than simply consuming their souls. Some claimed they could feel his gratitude, a vast and gentle consciousness acknowledging their sacrifice with something, approaching love rather than mere necessity. The numbers required for daily feeding decreased slowly, incrementally, year by year. At the current rate, tech priests calculated, in perhaps 10,000 more years, he might sustain himself entirely through faith alone, requiring no more deaths to maintain his vigil. 10,000 years, an eternity to an individual, an eye blink to a species. Humanity had chosen to measure time not in epochs, but in generations, to find meaning not in eternal transcendence, but in the brief, bright spark of individual lives that together formed something greater than their sum. Throughout the galaxy, subtle changes rippled outward. The Tyranid hive fleets continued their approach, but their movements became less organized, as if the guiding intelligence that had directed them had withdrawn. They remained a threat, yes, but a comprehensible one. A natural disaster rather than a cosmic test. The Orcs fought with the same vigor, but without the sense of underlying purpose that had always haunted their wars. They were just Orcs now, violent and dangerous, but not instruments of some ancient design. Even the Necrons, those bitter remnants of the Old One's enemies, seemed to sense the shift. Some overlords reported dreams, impossible for beings without souls, of ancient observers finally turning their gaze away. The Eldar, who had always claimed special status as the Old One's favored children, struggled most with the revelation. Their entire civilization had been built on the foundation of being the inheritors of cosmic wisdom, the last remnants of a glorious design. To learn that the designers had withdrawn, that they were now just another species stumbling through a universe no longer shaped by ancient hands, this was almost too much to bear. Some fell deeper into despair, retreating into their craft worlds and closing themselves off from the galaxy entirely. Others found unexpected liberation in it. If they were no longer the Old One's chosen children, then perhaps they could choose their own destiny. Perhaps they could forge alliances, make compromises, find new meanings beyond the endless decline their seers had always prophesied. On a world at the eastern fringe, a rogue trader named Meridian Vex stood in her private quarters, staring at the flower she had taken from that impossible garden so many years ago. It had finally begun to wilt. After 60 years of perfect preservation, sustained by principles that violated natural law, it was dying. She watched the petals brown and curl, watched the stem bow under weight that had never troubled it before. And she smiled, because dying meant it had been alive, Truly alive, not just preserved in stasis. The old one's maintenance had ceased, and now the garden was free to bloom and wither according to its own nature. She placed the flower gently in a disposal unit and whispered a prayer to the Emperor, not for salvation or protection, but simply in gratitude, for the chance to witness something beautiful return to the natural cycle of existence, for the privilege of living in a universe where things could end, and an ending proved they had mattered. The question that had haunted the listening post crew, that had driven inquisitors mad and broken the certainty of the faithful, slowly evolved into something less terrifying. Yes, we were designed. Yes, we were created for a purpose not our own. Yes, we have been watched since before we knew we existed. But knowing this changed nothing about the essential nature of human experience. A child's laugh is no less joyful for knowing that the capacity for joy was engineered. A soldier's sacrifice is no less meaningful for understanding that courage was bred into our genetic code. Love does not diminish when you learn. It was designed to strengthen social bonds. We are what we choose to be in the moment of choosing. That is the miracle the old ones never understood. That is the variable they could not account for in their equations. Purpose is not something bestowed by creators or discovered in cosmic design. Purpose is something each consciousness generates for itself, moment by moment, choice by choice, across the brief span of awareness we call life. In the deep archives of the Inquisition, in records sealed behind locks that will never open, there exists a single document. A letter written by Inquisitor Thaddeus Varn in the minutes before listening post Epsilon 79 went dark forever. It was never meant to be read, never meant to survive. But somehow it did. And in it, he wrote something that perhaps captures the truth better than all the theological debates and philosophical treatises that followed. We spend our lives looking for meaning in the stars, in the warp, in ancient ruins and Xenos mysteries. We ask the universe to tell us why we exist, but the universe is silent. It has always been silent. The old ones could have told us our purpose, but they learned to keep their distance. The Emperor could reveal the grand design, but he chooses to let us find our own way. The silence is not cruelty. It is the greatest gift any creator could give their creation. The freedom to answer the question ourselves. We exist because we choose to. We matter because we decide we matter. And that choice, that simple, impossible, irrational choice to find meaning in a universe that offers none, that is what makes us human. That is what saved us from harvest. That is what the old ones are watching now, with what I imagine must be something like wonder. They are watching to see what happens when a species creates its own purpose from nothing but will and hope, and the stubborn refusal to accept that existence must have a reason beyond existing. The letter ends there. No signature. No final proclamation. Just those words floating in the dark of sealed archives, waiting for the day when someone might find them and understand. On Terra, the Astronomicon continues to burn. Its light guides ships through the warp, as it has for 10 millennia. But now, those sensitive enough to truly perceive it report a subtle change in its quality. It feels less like a beacon maintained through sacrifice, and more like a gift given freely. Less like a last desperate attempt to hold back the darkness, and more like a calm, patient promise that the darkness can be endured. Humanity endures. Not because we were designed to endure, though we were. Not because ancient gods protect us, though perhaps they do. We endure because we choose to morning after morning. World after world, soul after soul, each of us deciding that our brief moment of consciousness matters enough to fill it with meaning of our own making. Somewhere in dimensions we cannot perceive, the old ones watch. They watch without interfering, observe without controlling, witness without judging. They are learning something they never imagined they could learn. They are watching their most sophisticated creation choose imperfection, choose mortality, choose to write its own story rather than fulfill a predetermined script. And perhaps, after 60 million years of watching species rise and fall according to their designs, they have finally encountered something that surprises them. Something that violates their equations and contradicts their certainties. Something that makes the cosmic experiment worth continuing. They are watching us become what we choose to be. And in that choice, in that simple, magnificent act of self-determination, we have finally given them the one thing they never had. The possibility that they too could change, could choose, could become something other than what they were made to be. The old ones never died. They never left. They are still watching. And what they see, for the first time in their incomprehensible existence, is a species that watches back, that looks into the cosmic dark, acknowledges the presence of its creators, and says with quiet defiance, "We see you, we understand what you intended for us, and we choose differently." That is our purpose now. Not the one we were given, but the one we made. To be human in a universe that tried to make us something else. To find meaning in the act of choosing meaning. To exist not because we must, but because we decided existence was worth the cost. And that choice echoes across the stars, through the warp, into dimensions beyond naming. A single note of defiant hope in a universe that had forgotten hope was possible. The old ones are listening to that note now, learning from it. Perhaps in time, even they might understand what we have learned through our 10,000 years of suffering and sacrifice. Sometimes the most profound act of rebellion is simply choosing to be yourself.